Have you ever wondered what it takes for a single voice to shatter centuries of silence? What happens when one person decides that enough is enough, that the weight of chains can no longer hold down the spirit of those who refuse to be sold like cattle? Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story that history tried to bury. A story that took place on a cold November night in 1829 in a small river town called Cairo, at the very tip of Illinois, where the Ohio meets the Mississippi. Two great rivers converging, carrying with them the tears and blood of thousands who passed through that place in chains. But this story isn't about chains. It's about what happens when someone decides to break them. Not with weapons, not with an army. With something far more dangerous to those who profit from human flesh. A voice. Her name was Mercy. And what she did on that night changed everything. If you're new here and you care about the stories that shaped this nation, the ones they don't teach in schools, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to reveal will make you question everything you thought you knew about resistance, about courage, about the price of freedom. Stay with me until the end, because the final moments of this story will leave you speechless. The ruins still stand there, if you know where to look. Along the muddy banks where Cairo once thrived as a gateway between north and south, you can still find the remnants of that old auction house. The wooden beams have rotted into the earth, consumed by decades of flooding and neglect, but the foundation stones remain. Gray limestone blocks imported at great expense from quarries upriver, now covered in moss and forgotten by all but a few local historians who whisper about what happened there. They say that on certain November nights when the fog rolls in thick from the confluence of the two rivers, you can still hear it. Not screams, not the crack of whips. Something worse. A silence so profound it seems to swallow all sound, followed by a single voice rising from nowhere, cutting through the mist like a blade through flesh. The old-timers call it Mercy's echo. They cross themselves when they speak of it. Some claim it's a ghost. Others say it's just the wind playing tricks through the hollow foundations. But those who have heard it, truly heard it, know better. They know that some acts of defiance are so powerful they leave permanent scars on the very air itself. This is not a story about a slave auction. This is a story about the night a woman named Mercy Washington decided that if she was going to be sold, she would make certain that everyone present would remember the cost of their complicity until their dying breath. This is the story of how one voice, raised at precisely the right moment, sparked a fire that would burn across 3 states and change the calculus of human trafficking along the entire Mississippi River corridor. What Mercy did was neither violent nor passive. It was something far more subversive. She weaponized the one thing her captors never expected her to possess: the truth. If you want to follow more cases like this one, stories that shake society to its core and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any investigation. Cairo in 1829 was not the dying town it would become. It was a place of tremendous promise and equally tremendous cruelty. Situated at the exact point where the Ohio River surrenders its waters to the mighty Mississippi, the town occupied perhaps the most strategically important piece of real estate in the entire American interior. Here, the free states of the North brushed against the slave states of the South. Here, commerce flowed in every direction. Cotton heading north, manufactured goods heading south, and human beings, thousands upon thousands of human beings, passing through in chains, their bodies converted into currency, their futures erased with the stroke of an auctioneer's gavel. The auction house stood 300 feet from the water's edge, a 2-story structure of whitewashed pine boards and imported limestone foundation. It measured 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a raised platform at one end where the merchandise, for that is what they called human beings, would be displayed. The ceiling rose 18 feet high, designed to accommodate the crowds that would gather for the monthly sales. Whale oil lamps hung from iron hooks, casting their yellow light across the proceedings, creating shadows that danced and flickered like the souls of those who had already passed through this chamber of horrors. The building had been constructed in 1824 by a consortium of investors from Louisville, Memphis, and New Orleans. They called it the Cairo Exchange, a deliberately neutral term that obscured its true purpose. The architecture itself was designed for efficiency. Wide doors at the back through which the enslaved could be brought directly from the holding pens, a series of small rooms along one side where potential buyers could conduct private inspections, and an elevated office at the front where the auction master could oversee his domain like a king surveying his kingdom. The holding pens occupied a separate building behind the exchange, connected by a covered walkway. Here, wooden cells measuring 8 feet by 8 feet held anywhere from 2 to 6 people each, depending on the size of the upcoming sale. The walls between cells were solid, preventing communication, isolating each person in their own private hell of anticipation. A single privy pit served all the cells, its stench a constant presence that the auction operators made no effort to mask. They believed, correctly in most cases, that the degradation of the holding period made the enslaved more compliant when they finally stood on the auction block. The hierarchy of this place operated with military precision. At the top sat Colonel Josiah Blackwood, the auction master himself, a transplant from Virginia who had made his fortune in the internal slave trade after the African trade was officially banned in 1808. Blackwood was 53 years old in 1829, a man of medium height with a belly that spoke of prosperity and a face that seemed incapable of expressing any emotion beyond mild irritation. He wore the same black suit to every auction, believing it lent an air of respectability to the proceedings. His hands were soft, the hands of a man who had never performed physical labor, yet those hands had signed bills of sale for over 12,000 human beings in his career. Beneath Blackwood worked the overseers, a rotating cast of men whose primary qualification was a willingness to perform violence without hesitation. They carried short leather whips coiled at their belts, more as symbols of authority than practical tools. The threat of the whip was usually sufficient. The head overseer in November of 1829 was a man named Thomas Drucker, a Pennsylvanian who had drifted south after a series of failed business ventures. Drucker was unusual in that he rarely raised his voice. He preferred to deliver his commands in a near whisper, forcing his victims to lean in close to hear him, creating an intimacy of terror that other overseers achieved only through shouting. The routine of the Cairo exchange followed a predictable pattern. Shipments arrived by steamboat, usually from points south, though occasionally from upriver as well. Families being broken up in Kentucky, individuals being sold further south as punishment, estate sales liquidating entire plantations worth of human property, all of it flowed through Cairo. Upon arrival, the enslaved would be processed, names recorded or assigned if they refused to give theirs, ages estimated, skills cataloged, health assessed. This last process was particularly invasive, conducted by a physician named Dr. Harold Sims, who received $3 per examination and who had developed a series of techniques for concealing defects that might lower prices. The schedule never varied, arrivals on Monday through Wednesday, processing on Thursday, public viewing on Friday, auction on Saturday, departure of purchases on Monday, the rhythm of commerce punctuated by the destruction of families. Sound was the constant companion of everyone at the Cairo exchange, the slap of water against the levee, the creak of wooden walls settling in the humidity, the distant calls of steamboat pilots navigating the treacherous confluence, the clanking of chains being removed and reattached, the murmur of buyers inspecting their potential purchases, and beneath it all, the sound that no one ever acknowledged but everyone heard, the quiet weeping that leaked through the walls of the holding cells at night when even the most hardened spirit could not maintain its composure. The smell was worse than the sound. River mud, whale oil smoke, unwashed bodies confined in close quarters, the privy pit, the particular scent of fear that manifests as sweat with an acidic edge. All of it combined into an olfactory assault that visitors from more genteel places found overwhelming. But those who worked at the exchange grew accustomed to it. They had to. The alternative was to acknowledge what they were breathing in, the physical emanation of human suffering. The November of 1829 had been colder than usual. Ice had already begun forming along the banks of the Ohio, and the Mississippi ran sluggish and brown with sediment. The cold concentrated the smells inside the buildings, trapped them beneath low ceilings, made every breath an act of intimacy with despair. It was into this environment that Mercy Washington arrived on Monday, November 16, 1829, packed into the lower deck of the steamboat Natchez, along with 47 other human beings whose lives were about to be auctioned away. The sky that day was the color of dirty wool. Clouds hung low over the rivers, threatening snow that never quite materialized. The temperature hovered just above freezing, cold enough to make the enslaved shiver in their thin clothing, but not cold enough to postpone the sale. Colonel Blackwood stood on the levee watching the Natchez dock, mentally calculating the potential revenue represented by its human cargo. He had received the manifest in advance, 48 souls, a good mix of field hands and skilled workers, several women of childbearing age who would fetch premium prices, a few children who could be sold either with their mothers or separately depending on market demand. What the manifest did not reveal, what Blackwood could not have known as he watched the line of people shuffle down the gangplank and onto the frozen mud of the Cairo waterfront, was that one of those 48 individuals was not simply merchandise. One of them carried within her a weapon more dangerous than any firearm, more devastating than any torch. One of them had spent 18 months preparing for this moment, memorizing names, collecting testimony, documenting atrocities, building a case that would expose not just the Cairo exchange, but the entire network of human trafficking that flowed through this God-forsaken confluence. Her name was listed on the manifest as Mercy Female, approximately 32 years. House servant, literate, skilled seamstress. The notation about literacy should have been a warning. Literate slaves were considered dangerous, unpredictable, infected with ideas that made them unsuitable for field work. But Mercy had been careful to downplay this skill, to present herself as barely able to read simple words, nothing more. She had learned early that survival depended on being underestimated. What the manifest could not capture, what no bill of sale could ever quantify, was the fire that burned behind Mercy Washington's eyes. A fire that had been kindled 32 years earlier in the tobacco fields of Virginia, fed by every injustice she had witnessed, every family torn apart, every body broken by labor and violence. That fire had nearly consumed her many times, after her mother was sold away when Mercy was 7, after her first husband was beaten to death for looking at an overseer the wrong way, after her daughter was taken from her arms at the age of 4 and sent to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. Each loss had added fuel to the flames until they burned with an intensity that she had learned to hide behind a mask of perfect servility. But Mercy was done hiding. She had made her decision 18 months ago, after the incident that finally broke something inside her, or perhaps fixed something. She could never decide which. What she knew with absolute certainty was that she was walking into the Cairo exchange not as a victim, but as an instrument of reckoning. What she was about to do would either destroy her or destroy them, perhaps both. She had made her peace with either outcome. The line of the enslaved shuffled forward, ankle chains clinking against the wooden gangplank. Mercy kept her eyes down, her posture submissive, her face blank. She had learned to make her body lie while her mind remained sharp and watchful. She observed everything. The number of overseers, 7. The weapons they carried, whips and clubs, 2 pistols visible, the layout of the landing area, the distance to the holding pens, the position of the steamboats along the levee, the ice forming along the riverbanks. All of it filed away, cross-referenced with information she had gathered from other enslaved people she had met during her time at the Hartwell plantation in Kentucky, where she had spent the last 3 years planning for this moment. Colonel Blackwood walked along the line, conducting his preliminary assessment. He paused in front of Mercy, his eyes moving over her body with the practiced detachment of a farmer examining livestock. She felt his gaze like insects crawling across her skin but kept her expression neutral. "This one," Blackwood said to Drucker, who trailed behind him with a ledger. 32, the manifest says. Looks older. Make sure Sims checks her teeth. And note the hands. Those are seamstress hands. We might get $800 for her if she's healthy." $800. That was her value, reduced to a number. Mercy filed this information away as well. It might prove useful. The processing took 3 days, just as Mercy had anticipated. 3 days of being examined, measured, questioned about her skills and her history. She answered truthfully about her abilities. Seamstress, yes, also skilled in household management, cooking, basic nursing. She lied about everything else. Her former owner? Dead from fever, his estate being liquidated. Her family? No surviving relatives that she knew of. Her behavior record? Unblemished, compliant, no history of running or disobedience. The lies came easily. She had been practicing them for years. What she did not tell them was that her former owner, James Hartwell of Bourbon County, Kentucky, was very much alive and had sold her specifically because she knew too much. What she did not tell them was that she had spent 3 years in the Hartwell household systematically documenting every illegal transaction, every bribed official, every murdered slave whose death had been covered up, every child sold without the required paperwork, every woman raped and then sold away when she became pregnant. She had memorized dates, names, amounts, methods. She had committed testimony from dozens of witnesses to memory, knowing that paper could be discovered and destroyed, but that knowledge lodged in a human mind could not be confiscated. What she did not tell them was that she had arranged to be sold at the Cairo exchange specifically because this was the hub, the nexus, the center of the web. The men who operated this place were connected to plantation owners across 6 states, to shipping companies, to banks, to politicians, to judges. They were the spider at the center of the web, and Mercy intended to set that web on fire. The processing complete, Mercy was assigned to a cell in the holding building. 8 feet by 8 feet, shared with 3 other women. The walls were rough-hewn pine, the floor packed earth, the ceiling low enough that Mercy could touch it if she raised her arm. A single bucket served as their toilet. No bedding, no light except what filtered through the cracks in the walls. The November cold seeped through every gap, making sleep nearly impossible. But Mercy was not interested in sleep. She was interested in information. Over the next 2 days, she spoke quietly with her cellmates, with the women in adjacent cells, with anyone she could reach through the walls. She gathered names, stories, connections. Each piece of information added to the map she was building in her mind, the map that would guide her when the moment came. Friday arrived, and with it the public viewing. Potential buyers would walk through the holding area, examining the merchandise, asking questions, making notes. Some would request private viewings, which meant being taken to one of the small rooms in the exchange where buyers could conduct more thorough examinations. Mercy had heard stories about what happened in those rooms. She had prepared herself for the possibility that she would have to endure such an examination. She had decided that she would comply, would give them nothing to use against her, would save her defiance for the moment when it would matter most. The morning of the viewing, the overseers came through the cells with buckets of cold water, forcing the enslaved to wash themselves, to look presentable for the buyers. New clothes were distributed, simple shifts for the women, rough cotton pants and shirts for the men. Mercy dressed herself mechanically, her mind already running through the sequence of events she had planned. The viewing began at 10 o'clock. Buyers moved through the holding area in clusters, accompanied by overseers who answered questions and recited the relevant information from the ledgers. Mercy stood at the front of her cell, visible through the bars, her posture erect, her expression neutral. She watched the buyers without appearing to watch them. She categorized them in her mind, the seasoned traders who moved quickly and efficiently, the plantation owners looking for specific skills, the small farmers hoping for a bargain, the men whose eyes lingered too long on the women with a hunger that had nothing to do with labor. One man stood out from the rest. He was perhaps 45 years old, well-dressed in the manner of someone with money, but not aristocratic pretensions. He moved through the holding area with a notebook in his hand, asking detailed questions, making careful observations. Unlike the other buyers, he seemed interested in the enslaved as people rather than products. He asked about families, about skills, about where they had come from. The overseers tolerated his questions with barely concealed annoyance. Mercy filed him away in her mental catalog. She did not know who he was, but she sensed that he might be important. The man paused in front of her cell. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, Mercy felt something pass between them, a recognition of some kind, though she could not have said what was being recognized. "This one," the man said to the overseer accompanying him. "What's her story?" The overseer consulted his ledger. Mercy, 32 years, house servant seamstress, literate supposedly, though only basic reading. Estate sale from Kentucky. No discipline problems on record. Starting bid will be $700. The man made a note in his book. "May I speak with her?" The overseer shrugged. "If you want. Don't know what you expect to learn that ain't in the ledger." The man stepped closer to the bars. "Good morning," he said to Mercy. "My name is Edward Coles. I'm interested in your history if you're willing to share it." Mercy recognized the name. Edward Coles, former governor of Illinois, famously opposed to slavery. What was he doing at a slave auction? "Not much to tell, sir," Mercy said, keeping her voice flat. "I was born in Virginia, sold to Kentucky when I was 15, worked in the house mostly. Now I'm here." "And your family?" "Gone, sir. All gone." Coles nodded slowly, something shifting behind his eyes. "I'm sorry to hear that. Truly sorry." He made another note in his book. "I may see you tomorrow, Mercy. I hope your circumstances improve." He moved on to the next cell, leaving Mercy to wonder what his presence here meant. A former governor, an opponent of slavery, attending a slave auction. He wasn't here to buy. That much was clear from the way he moved, the questions he asked. He was here to observe, to document, to bear witness, perhaps even to expose. Perhaps he was an ally. Perhaps he was a threat. Mercy could not tell, and she could not afford to rely on anyone else's plan. She had her own reckoning to deliver, and nothing would deter her from it. The viewing continued throughout the day. By evening, the buyers had departed, and the enslaved were returned to their cells for one final night before the auction. Mercy lay on the cold ground, her eyes open in the darkness, running through her plan one final time. Tomorrow, when she stood on that auction block, she would speak. Not to plead for mercy, she had abandoned hope of that kind years ago. She would speak to accuse, she would name names, she would reveal crimes, she would force every person in that room to confront the reality of what they were participating in, and she would do it loudly enough, clearly enough, that the words could not be ignored, could not be forgotten, could not be unheard. They would silence her, of course. They would drag her off the stage, punish her, possibly kill her. She had accepted this. But the words would be out. The accusations would be public. And in a room full of buyers, in a town full of witnesses, with a former governor taking notes, those words would spread. They would reach newspapers, they would reach courts, they would reach the ears of people who had the power to act. That was the weapon Mercy Washington carried into the Cairo exchange. Not a knife, not a gun, not poison. Words. The truth. Spoken at a moment when silencing her would only amplify what she said. She had spent 18 months preparing those words, memorizing them, rehearsing them in her mind until they flowed as naturally as breathing. Tomorrow, she would deliver them. And then, whatever came next, she would face it knowing that she had done something that could not be undone. The night passed slowly. The cold deepened. Somewhere in the distance, a steamboat whistle echoed across the water. Mercy closed her eyes and waited for dawn. Leave in the comments. Never give up on the truth if you believe that justice must reach all the oppressed. Saturday, November 21st, 1829, the day of the auction, the day that would change everything. The morning began with the same routine that had governed every auction day at the Cairo Exchange for 5 years. The enslaved were roused before dawn, given a meager breakfast of cornmeal mush, and lined up for final inspection. Hair was combed, faces were washed, clothes were straightened. The goal was to make the merchandise presentable, to maximize the prices that buyers would pay. Mercy moved through the preparations without resistance, conserving her energy for what lay ahead. She allowed the overseer's wife to comb her hair, accepted the clean shift she was given, stood patiently while her teeth were checked one final time. She was the model of compliance, of submission, of the broken spirit that made for a tractable slave. Inside, her heart beat with a rhythm that seemed to shake her entire body. But she kept her hands steady, her breathing even, her face blank. The auction was scheduled to begin at noon. By 11 o'clock, the main hall of the Cairo Exchange was filling with buyers. Mercy could hear them through the walls of the holding area, the rumble of conversation, the scrape of chairs, the clink of glasses. The auction was a social event as much as a commercial transaction, an opportunity for planters and traders to catch up on news, to make deals, to reinforce the bonds of a society built on human trafficking. The enslaved were brought out in lots, organized by perceived value. Field hands first, then skilled workers, then house servants, then women of particular interest, then families that were being sold intact. Mercy had been assigned to the house servant lot, which would be auctioned in the middle of the day. She waited in the staging area just behind the main hall, listening to the auction unfold. Colonel Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the thin walls, his practiced patter designed to build excitement and drive up prices. "What am I bid for this fine specimen? Strong back, good teeth, experienced in cotton. Do I hear 500? 500 from the gentleman in the gray coat. Do I hear 550? 550, thank you, sir. 600? The bidding stands at 550, gentlemen. This is a prime field hand. Don't let him go cheap." The words blurred together into a drone, a liturgy of commodification. Mercy listened not to the words, but to the rhythm, learning the pattern, identifying the moments when the audience was most attentive and when their attention flagged. The house servants were called forward at 1:30. Mercy was third in the line of 8 women. She followed the 2 ahead of her through the door and onto the raised platform at the front of the hall. The light inside the exchange was disorienting after the dimness of the holding area. Whale oil lamps blazed from every wall, supplemented by candles and sconces, and 2 large windows at the front that let in the pale November daylight. The room was packed. Mercy estimated nearly 200 people, almost all of them white men, seated on benches or standing along the walls. The smell of tobacco smoke, whiskey, and unwashed bodies formed a thick cloud beneath the high ceiling. She scanned the crowd as she mounted the platform, keeping her eyes down but taking in everything through her peripheral vision. There, near the front, a group of well-dressed planters from Mississippi, their clothing marking them as men of means. There, along the left wall, a cluster of slave traders, their faces hard and calculating. There, in the back corner, Edward Coles, the former governor, his notebook open on his knee, his pen moving steadily across the page. And there, standing beside Colonel Blackwood on the raised dais reserved for the auctioneer, Thomas Drucker, the head overseer, his eyes scanning the line of women with a predator's attention. The first woman was sold for $650 to a planter from Natchez. The second went for $725, her price driven up by a bidding war between 2 men who seemed more interested in defeating each other than in acquiring her labor. Throughout both sales, the room maintained the atmosphere of a particularly morbid entertainment, with jokes and asides exchanged between buyers, drinks refilled by servants who moved through the crowd, cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling. Then it was Mercy's turn. Colonel Blackwood consulted his ledger as Mercy stepped forward to the center of the platform. "Lot number 37, he announced. Mercy female, age 32. Skilled seamstress, literate, experienced in household management, estate sale, excellent references, opening bid, $700. A moment of quiet as the buyers assessed her. Mercy stood straight, her eyes fixed on a point above the crowd's heads, her hands clasped in front of her. The picture of submission. "Do I hear 700? $700 for this skilled house servant?" A hand rose in the middle of the room. 700. 700, thank you. "Do I hear 750? 750 for a literate seamstress, gentlemen, a rare commodity. 750. 800? 800. The bidding climbed steadily. 850. 900. The room seemed to settle into the familiar rhythm of the auction, the back and forth between bidders that would continue until only one remained. At $950, there was a pause. Blackwood scanned the room. 950 standing. "Do I hear 1,000? $1,000, gentlemen, for a skilled..." 1,000. The voice came from the back of the room. Heads turned. Edward Coles had risen from his seat, his hand raised, his face calm. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several men exchanged glances. Coles was known to them, knew his views on slavery, knew that he had freed his own slaves upon arriving in Illinois. What was he doing bidding on a slave? Blackwood hesitated for a moment, then continued. 1,000 from Mr. Coles. Do I hear 1050? Silence. The previous bidders seemed uncertain how to proceed. Whatever game Coles was playing, they weren't sure they wanted to compete. Going once at 1,000, going twice. This was the moment. Mercy had not planned for Coles's intervention, but she recognized it for what it was, an opportunity. His bid had captured the room's attention, created a moment of uncertainty, broken the automatic rhythm of the auction. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Mercy stepped forward, raising her head for the first time since mounting the platform. She looked directly at Colonel Blackwood, then turned to face the crowd. "Before I am sold," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room, "there are things this room should know." For a moment, no one moved. The words hung in the air, unprecedented, impossible. Slaves did not speak at auctions. Slaves did not address buyers. Slaves did not— "Someone silence her," Blackwood snapped, gesturing to Drucker. The overseer moved forward, reaching for Mercy's arm. She stepped back, just out of his reach, and raised her voice. Colonel Josiah Blackwood arranged the murder of Thomas Reynolds, a free black man in Memphis in October of 1827. Reynolds had documented illegal sales to Cuba. His body was found in the river 3 days after meeting with the colonel. The room erupted. Men surged to their feet. Shouts and exclamations drowned out Blackwood's sputtered denials. Drucker lunged for Mercy, but she was already moving, stepping to the edge of the platform, positioning herself where seizing her would mean doing so in full view of everyone present. In March of 1828, Dr. Harold Sims falsified medical records for 17 enslaved persons sold through this exchange, concealing consumption that resulted in 4 deaths within 6 months of purchase. The buyers were defrauded. The dead were discarded. Sims, who had been standing near the back of the room, turned pale and began pushing toward the door. James Hartwell of Bourbon County, Kentucky, fathered 3 children by enslaved women in his household. When one of those children, a girl named Rose, turned 12 years old, he sold her to a brothel in New Orleans. I know this because Rose was my daughter. The room had gone almost quiet now. Even Drucker had stopped moving, frozen by the enormity of what was happening. Mercy's voice, clear and controlled, filled the space. I have names. I have dates. I have amounts. I have testimony from dozens of enslaved people who witnessed these crimes. I have committed all of it to memory, where it cannot be taken from me, cannot be burned, cannot be destroyed. She turned to look directly at Edward Coles, who sat motionless in his seat, his pen suspended above his notebook. I know you, Mr. Coles. I know what you believe. I know why you're here. Everything I have said is true. I can provide evidence. If you want to destroy this place and everything it represents, I will give you the means to do it. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt like an hour. Then Blackwood found his voice. Seize her! Get her off this platform! She's lying! She's insane! But it was too late. The words had been spoken. 200 men had heard them. More importantly, Edward Coles had heard them and was even now writing furiously in his notebook, documenting everything. Drucker grabbed Mercy's arm, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. She did not resist. There was no need. She had done what she came to do. As she was dragged from the platform, she caught one last glimpse of the room. Chaos. Buyers shouting questions, demanding answers. Blackwood's face, purple with rage. Dr. Sims, gone, fled through a side door. And Coles, still writing, his face set in an expression of grim determination. The door closed behind her. The sound of the auction room faded. Mercy was pulled into the darkness of the back corridor, where Drucker's fist connected with her face and the world dissolved into ringing blackness. But even as consciousness slipped away, she smiled. The words were out. The truth was loose. And nothing could put it back. The night that followed Mercy's testimony was unlike anything Cairo had witnessed before. The auction collapsed into disorder within minutes of her removal from the platform. Buyers demanded explanations from Blackwood, who had no answers to give. Edward Coles rose from his seat and announced, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that he would be filing a formal complaint with the governor of Illinois and requesting an investigation into the allegations raised. The room cleared rapidly after that. Men who had come prepared to spend thousands of dollars on human flesh suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. The remaining enslaved individuals were herded back to the holding cells, their fates uncertain in the chaos that had engulfed the exchange. Mercy regained consciousness in one of the small rooms that had been used for private inspections. Her left eye was swollen shut. Blood crusted her upper lip from where Drucker's blow had split her skin against her teeth. Her hands had been bound behind her back with rope that bit into her wrists. She was not alone in the room. Colonel Blackwood stood before her, his composure shattered, his voice a barely controlled whisper. "Who told you these things?" he demanded. "Who gave you this information?" Mercy said nothing. "The Reynolds matter. No one knew about that. No one. How could you possibly?" "I listened," Mercy said, her voice steady despite the pain. "Enslaved people are invisible to you. You speak freely in front of us. You assume we don't understand, don't remember, don't matter. But we hear everything. We remember everything. And sometimes we talk to each other." Blackwood's face contorted. "You've destroyed yourself, you know that. What you did out there. I could have you killed for that. I could have you killed tonight, and no one would say a word. Then do it." The simple statement seemed to take Blackwood off guard. He had expected fear, pleading, an attempt to bargain. What he found instead was a woman who had made her peace with death and no longer feared anything he could do to her. "You think dying makes you a martyr?" Blackwood sneered. "You think anyone will remember what you said out there? By morning, everyone will have convinced themselves they heard a madwoman raving. Your testimony will be dismissed as the delusions of a deranged slave trying to avoid being sold." "Perhaps," Mercy said, "but Mr. Coles wrote it all down, and Mr. Coles is not someone you can silence." Blackwood's face went pale. He had forgotten about Coles, forgotten that the former governor had been documenting everything, forgotten that there was now a written record in the hands of someone beyond his reach. The colonel left without another word. The door slammed behind him. Mercy closed her eyes and waited. She had played her hand. Now all she could do was see how the cards fell. The cards fell in ways that neither Mercy nor Blackwood could have predicted. Edward Coles did not wait until morning. That very night, he rode to Springfield, covering the distance in a series of post-horse relays that left him exhausted but determined. By Monday afternoon, he was in the office of Governor Ninian Edwards, laying out everything he had witnessed and recorded. Edwards was not a man known for strong moral convictions on the subject of slavery. Illinois was technically a free state, but the reality was more complicated. The Cairo exchange operated in a legal gray area, facilitated by corrupt officials who looked the other way in exchange for bribes. Edwards himself had accepted contributions from men connected to the slave trade. But what Coles presented was different. This was not an abstract moral argument about the evils of slavery. This was a detailed account of specific crimes: murder, fraud, falsification of official documents, violation of laws governing the sale of human beings. These were charges that could not be ignored without political consequences. More importantly, Coles made clear that he intended to publicize the matter regardless of what Edwards did. He had already sent copies of his notes to newspaper editors in Chicago, Cincinnati, and Philadelphia. The story would break within days. The only question was whether Illinois would be seen as complicit in the crimes or as taking action against them. Edwards, a pragmatist above all else, chose action. Within a week, a team of investigators had been dispatched to Cairo. Colonel Blackwood was arrested on December 1, 1829, on charges of fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. Dr. Sims was apprehended in Louisville 2 days later, trying to board a steamboat to New Orleans. Thomas Drucker disappeared entirely. Some said he had fled to Texas, others claimed his body had been found floating in the Mississippi, weighted down with chains from the auction house. The Cairo exchange was shut down. The enslaved people who had been awaiting sale were held in limbo while courts determined their status. Some were eventually returned to their owners. Others, whose ownership records had been falsified or lost in the chaos, found themselves in a legal no-man's land that allowed sympathetic lawyers to argue for their freedom. And Mercy Washington? Mercy's fate remained uncertain in the immediate aftermath of the auction. She was kept in isolation, moved from the exchange to the Cairo jail, then to a facility in Springfield as the investigation proceeded. For 3 months, she existed in a state of suspended animation, neither enslaved nor free, her future dependent on decisions being made by men in distant offices. During this time, she was interviewed extensively by investigators, lawyers, and eventually by Edward Coles himself. She provided everything she had promised: names, dates, transactions, testimony. Her memory proved to be extraordinary. She recalled details that the investigators were later able to corroborate through physical evidence, confirming the accuracy of her accounts. The case against Blackwood and his associates grew stronger with each passing week. Mercy's testimony, combined with the documentary evidence seized from the exchange and the confessions of lower-level participants seeking to avoid prosecution, painted a picture of systematic criminality that shocked even those who had known the slave trade was corrupt. In March of 1830, a grand jury in Springfield handed down indictments against 7 individuals connected to the Cairo exchange. Colonel Blackwood was charged with murder, fraud, and violation of federal laws governing the slave trade. Dr. Sims faced charges of fraud and falsification of medical records. 5 others, including 2 bankers and a customs official, were indicted on conspiracy charges. The trials, which took place over the summer of 1830, became a national sensation. Newspapers across the country covered the proceedings, reprinting testimony that revealed the inner workings of the domestic slave trade in unprecedented detail. Abolitionists seized on the case as evidence of slavery's inherent corruption. Defenders of slavery attempted to dismiss the Cairo exchange as an aberration, a few bad actors whose crimes had nothing to do with the institution itself. Mercy was called to testify at 3 of the trials. Each time, she took the stand with the same calm determination she had shown on the auction platform, answering questions clearly and directly, refusing to be intimidated by the defense attorneys who attempted to undermine her credibility by attacking her character. Her testimony in the Blackwood murder trial was particularly devastating. She described in precise detail a conversation she had overheard between Blackwood and an associate named Marcus Webb, in which they discussed how to dispose of Thomas Reynolds after Reynolds threatened to expose their illegal sales to Cuba. She described the date, the location, the exact words used. She described what happened to Reynolds, how he was lured to a meeting at the Cairo exchange, struck on the head, weighted with chains, and thrown into the river. Webb, who had been arrested on conspiracy charges, confirmed Mercy's account in exchange for a reduced sentence. He led investigators to the spot where Reynolds had been killed and showed them a bloodstain on the floor that had never been completely cleaned. Colonel Blackwood was convicted of murder on August 14, 1830. He was sentenced to death by hanging. Dr. Sims received 15 years in prison for fraud. The others received sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. But the legal outcomes, as significant as they were, represented only part of the impact of what Mercy had set in motion. The Cairo exchange affair, as it came to be known, sent shockwaves through the entire system of human trafficking in the Mississippi River Valley. Slave traders who had operated with impunity suddenly found themselves subject to scrutiny. Banks that had financed slave sales began distancing themselves from the trade, afraid of being implicated in similar scandals. Corrupt officials who had facilitated illegal transactions realized that their protection was no longer guaranteed. Within a year of Mercy's testimony, slave auctions across Illinois had effectively ceased. The legal gray area that had allowed them to operate was closed by a combination of new legislation and rigorous enforcement. Cairo, which had been positioned to become one of the great commercial centers of the American interior, saw its economy collapse as the slave trade that had been its foundation dried up. The effects spread beyond Illinois. In Kentucky, James Hartwell, the man who had sold Mercy, the man who had fathered children by enslaved women and then sold those children, was subjected to a lawsuit by a group of investors who claimed he had defrauded them in land transactions. The lawsuit was nominally unrelated to slavery, but everyone understood its true purpose. Hartwell's exposure in the Cairo trials had made him vulnerable, and his enemies were moving against him. Hartwell lost the lawsuit and was forced to sell his plantation to cover his debts. He died in poverty 3 years later, alone in a rented room in Louisville, surrounded by empty whiskey bottles and unpaid bills. No one attended his funeral. The reverberations reached even further. In Congress, legislators pointed to the Cairo affair as evidence that the domestic slave trade required federal regulation. The debates that followed did not result in immediate legislation. The political power of the slave states was too strong for that. But they planted seeds that would bear fruit in the decades to come. And in black communities across the country, the name Mercy Washington became a symbol of resistance. Her story spread through the networks of communication that connected enslaved and free black people, whispered in kitchens, discussed in churches, commemorated in songs that survived long after the newspaper accounts had faded. She became known as the woman who spoke, the woman who broke the silence of the auction block, the woman who proved that the truth, spoken at the right moment, could shake the foundations of an entire system. But what happened to Mercy herself? Her legal status remained complicated even after the trials concluded. She was technically the property of James Hartwell's estate, which was now controlled by creditors who had no interest in an enslaved woman famous for testifying against slave traders. No one wanted to buy her. She was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too likely to cause trouble. Edward Coles, who had remained in contact with Mercy throughout the legal proceedings, offered a solution. He would purchase her from the estate for a nominal sum, $1, and immediately grant her freedom. The creditors, eager to dispose of a problematic asset, agreed. On October 3, 1830, Mercy Washington became a free woman. She was 33 years old. Freedom, after a lifetime of enslavement, was a disorienting experience. Mercy had spent so long focused on her mission, gathering information, preparing her testimony, surviving long enough to deliver it, that she had never truly considered what would come after. Now, suddenly, she had to build a life. She stayed in Illinois, settling in the town of Alton, about 20 miles north of St. Louis. Alton was home to a small but active free black community and had become a center of abolitionist activity. Mercy found work as a seamstress, using the skills that had been listed on her auction manifest to support herself in freedom. But she did not remain simply a seamstress for long. Her fame preceded her, and abolitionists sought her out, asking her to share her story. At first, Mercy was reluctant. She had spoken her truth on the auction block. She was not sure she wanted to relive it repeatedly. But she came to understand that her testimony was not just about the past. It was about the present and the future. Every time she told her story, she reminded people of what was happening in auction houses across the South at that very moment. She put a human face on the statistics, made real the suffering that many Northerners preferred to keep abstract. She began speaking at abolitionist meetings, first in Alton, then in Springfield, then in cities across the North. She was not a polished orator. Her style was direct, unadorned, almost matter-of-fact. But that directness was her power. She described what she had witnessed and experienced without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. The facts were devastating enough. Mercy's public speaking brought her into contact with other figures in the abolitionist movement. She met William Lloyd Garrison, who published an account of her testimony in The Liberator. She corresponded with Frederick Douglass, who was still enslaved at the time, but would later cite her as an inspiration for his own acts of resistance. She worked with Elijah Lovejoy, the abolitionist newspaper editor who would be murdered by a pro-slavery mob in Alton in 1837. Lovejoy's death affected Mercy deeply. She had known him, had worked with him, had considered him a friend. His murder was a reminder that resistance came with costs, that the forces arrayed against abolition were willing to kill to protect their interests. But she did not retreat. If anything, Lovejoy's death strengthened her resolve. She continued speaking, continued testifying, continued bearing witness to the horrors she had seen and the horrors that were still being perpetrated across the South. In 1838, she published a memoir titled The Auction Block, A Testimony. The book was written with the assistance of a white abolitionist named Sarah Grimke, who helped Mercy translate her spoken testimony into written form. It became one of the most influential slave narratives of the antebellum period, second only to Douglas's autobiography in its impact on Northern public opinion. The memoir contained not just Mercy's own story, but the stories of dozens of enslaved people she had known over the years. She had made herself a repository of their testimonies, a living archive of experiences that would otherwise have been lost. The book made those experiences permanent, preserved them for posterity, ensured that the suffering of people whose names had been erased from official records would not be forgotten. As Mercy's fame grew, so did the danger she faced. She received death threats regularly. Pro-slavery newspapers accused her of lying, of fabricating testimony, of being a tool of Northern radicals seeking to destroy the South. Bounty hunters occasionally appeared in Alton, asking questions about her whereabouts. She responded to these threats with the same calm determination she had shown on the auction platform. She knew that fear was a weapon, and she refused to let her enemies wield it against her. She continued her work, continued speaking, continued writing, even as the country drifted closer to the conflict that would eventually tear it apart. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act created new dangers for free black people across the North. Under the law, escaped slaves could be captured and returned to their owners, and anyone who assisted them faced severe penalties. More troublingly, the law's loose evidentiary standards meant that even free black people like Mercy could be kidnapped and sold into slavery based on fraudulent claims. Mercy responded by becoming more active in the Underground Railroad, the network of safe houses and secret routes that helped escaped slaves reach freedom in Canada. She opened her home in Alton to fugitives, providing shelter, food, and guidance on the journey north. She did this despite the risk. If caught, she could have been imprisoned or worse. "I spent 32 years in chains," she said when asked about the danger. "I would rather die free than live afraid." The Civil War, when it came, validated everything Mercy had worked for. The conflict that would end slavery was the direct result of decades of agitation, resistance, and testimony by people like her. The words she had spoken on the Cairo auction platform in 1829 were part of a chorus of voices that had gradually changed Northern public opinion, making the war possible. Mercy was 64 years old when the war began. Too old to participate directly, she contributed in other ways. She raised money for the Union cause. She spoke at recruitment rallies, urging black men to enlist. She visited hospitals, comforting wounded soldiers and writing letters for those who could not write themselves. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in January 1863, Mercy was among those gathered at the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Alton to hear the news. Witnesses described her standing in silence as the proclamation was read aloud, tears streaming down her face, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer. Afterward, someone asked her how she felt. "I feel like I've been holding my breath for 33 years, she said. "And finally, I can exhale." Mercy Washington did not live to see the end of the war. She died on April 9, 1864, almost exactly 1 year before Lee's surrender at Appomattox. She was 66 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but those who knew her believed she had simply worn out. Decades of struggle, of speaking, of remembering and reliving the horrors she had witnessed had taken their toll. She had given everything she had to the cause of freedom, and in the end, there was nothing left. Her funeral was held at the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the same church where she had heard the Emancipation Proclamation read aloud. Hundreds of people attended, black and white, free and formerly enslaved, abolitionists and ordinary citizens who had been moved by her story. Edward Coles, now in his 70s, traveled from Philadelphia to deliver a eulogy. "Mercy Washington," Coles said, "broke the silence of the auction block. In doing so, she gave voice to millions who had been denied the right to speak. She proved that the truth, spoken with courage, is more powerful than any chain. And she showed us that one voice, raised at the right moment, can change the course of history." Today, Mercy Washington is largely forgotten. Her memoir has been out of print for decades. Her name does not appear in most history textbooks. The Cairo exchange, where she delivered her famous testimony, has long since crumbled into the mud of the Mississippi. Even the town of Alton, where she spent her final decades, has little to commemorate her presence. but her legacy lives on in ways that are not always visible. Every time someone speaks truth to power, they walk the path that Mercy Washington walked. Every time someone refuses to be silenced, they honor her memory. Every time the truth is spoken at a moment when speaking it seems impossible, dangerous, futile, every time that happens, Mercy Washington stands with them, her voice joining theirs, her courage strengthening theirs. The auction block is silent now, but Mercy's echo remains. In the archives of the Illinois State Historical Society, there is a small collection of materials related to Mercy Washington. Among them is a letter she wrote late in her life to a young abolitionist who had asked for her advice. "You ask me how to find courage," Mercy wrote. "I tell you that courage is not something you find. It is something you build. You build it by speaking when you are afraid. You build it by telling the truth when lying would be easier. You build it by refusing to be silenced even when silence is safe. And you build it by remembering that you are not alone. Every person who has spoken before you is with you when you speak. Every person who will speak after you is waiting for your voice. We are all connected by the truth we share. And together, we are stronger than any chain." The letter is worn now, the paper fragile with age, the ink faded but still legible. It is one of the few physical traces of Mercy Washington that remain. But her words endure. And her example shines across the centuries, a beacon for all who would raise their voice against injustice. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so that I can know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Mercy Washington's story touched your heart. Share it so that the memory of Mercy Washington will never be forgotten. The night the slaves were auctioned in silence ended when one voice broke the order. That voice belonged to Mercy Washington, and its echo can still be heard today if you listen carefully enough. Some say that on November nights, when the fog rolls in thick over the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, you can still hear her. Not screaming, not pleading, simply speaking, telling the truth, breaking the silence. And perhaps, in some way that transcends time and space, she is still speaking, still testifying, still refusing to be silenced. Listen, can you hear her?